inside Angola Prison. The blood in the fields. Before we begin, smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe if you want more true crime stories that most people are too afraid to tell. Night in Angola Prison does not fall quietly. The sound of steel doors slamming echoes through the endless corridors, carried by the humid Louisiana air that presses down like a curse. On this particular night, the silence that followed those metallic crashes was broken by a scream, sharp, ragged, and cut short before it could finish. A correctional officer, patrolling the tier near Camp D, froze when he heard it. He knew screams inside Angola. They were part of the soundtrack of the prison. But this one was different. It carried a note of desperation, the kind of cry that comes only when a man knows death has arrived. The officer moved closer, his flashlight beam sweeping across cracked concrete and graffiti carved deep into the walls. When the light landed on cell 37, the beam caught something wet and glistening. Blood. It trickled under the steel door, forming a thin red line across the tier. Inside, 2 inmates, both affiliated with rival gangs, lay in the aftermath of something brutal. One slumped in the corner, barely breathing, the shank still in his chest. The other was on the floor, face down, hands trembling but empty. And in the corner of the cell, painted in blood, was a crude message: "You only leave Angola in a pine box." The murder scene inside Angola that night was not just another act of prison violence. It was the spark that reignited an investigation into one of America's darkest institutions. Angola, officially Louisiana State Penitentiary, is a place with a past so drenched in blood that every violent act feels like part of a cycle. Once a slave plantation, it was converted into a prison where the racial divisions of the Old South bled into modern incarceration. Guards on horseback still patrolled the fields, rifles slung casually as prisoners bent to pick cotton, soybeans, and sugarcane. The echoes of slavery never really left, they just changed uniforms. The victim that night was James "Red" Hollister, a white inmate with ties to the Aryan Brotherhood. The man clinging to life was Juan Soto, a Latin king who had been transferred into Angola only 6 months earlier. Their conflict had been brewing for weeks, hidden beneath the surface. But few could explain the bloody message left on the wall. Was it a warning from one gang to another? Or was it a statement directed at the system itself, a declaration that Angola was a prison you never escaped? Detective Marie Landry from West Feliciana Parish was called in. She had been inside Angola more times than she cared to remember, and every visit carried a weight. She stepped into Camp D with a notebook in her hand and a grim expression on her face. Landry wasn't new to prison killings, but something about this crime scene felt staged. The blood patterns didn't match a sudden eruption of violence. The writing on the wall seemed too deliberate, too theatrical. "This isn't just murder," she muttered under her breath. "This is a message." As the investigation unfolded, Angola's history became impossible to ignore. The prison's reputation had long been tainted by whispers, of guards betting on inmate fights, of men disappearing into solitary for years, of gangs running drug and contraband pipelines so vast that the prison walls felt meaningless. Reporters who had dared to write about Angola described it as a modern-day slave plantation. Lawsuits had exposed guards forcing prisoners into the cotton fields for pennies an hour. Former wardens defended the practice, saying it gave structure. But for the men out in those fields, it felt like bondage in everything but name. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Latin Kings were not the only factions here. The Black Guerrilla Family, the Mexican Mafia, and smaller local gangs carved out their own territory. Each dormitory, each camp, carried invisible borders, invisible rules. One wrong look, one whispered insult, could mean death. Landry began piecing together Hollister's final hours. The guards claimed the Aryan Brotherhood enforcer had been quiet all week, keeping to himself. But another inmate, speaking under condition of anonymity, told her a different story. Hollister had been in possession of a contraband cell phone, a lifeline to the outside world, and rumors swirled that he had used it to orchestrate a drug deal gone bad. That's why he was marked, the inmate said, eyes darting nervously around. The wall writing? That wasn't for him. That was for us. A warning. Step out of line and you're done. The prison's warden ordered silence. Officially, the death was logged as yet another gang conflict, tragic but expected inside a place like Angola. Unofficially, whispers began spreading through the tiers. Some said Hollister had been cooperating with guards, feeding them information. Others swore he had crossed the Latin kings by skimming off drug profits. For Landry, neither story explained the message. "You only leave Angola in a pine box" had been a phrase uttered for decades, almost like the prison's unofficial motto. But why write it now? Why here, in blood, as though someone wanted it documented? Her instincts told her the killing wasn't random. It was orchestrated. And the orchestration went deeper than gangs. She reviewed surveillance footage, but as often happened in Angola, the cameras covering that tier mysteriously malfunctioned hours before the killing. Guard logs were missing entries, and one officer assigned to the block that night called in sick the next day and never returned to work. Landry knew what that meant. Someone on the inside, perhaps even in uniform, had let this happen. The deeper she dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Angola had long been a place where corruption thrived. Guards were caught smuggling in drugs, phones, even weapons. Wardens were accused of turning a blind eye so long as the violence stayed contained. And then came the discovery that made her pause. In Hollister's cell, under the mattress, taped in plastic, was a small black notebook. Inside were numbers, coded entries, and initials. At first, it looked like gibberish. But one entry stood out. AB plus LK equals arrangement. Payment delayed. Resolution pending. Hollister, it seemed, had been keeping track of something bigger, perhaps a deal between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Latin kings. The notebook hinted at smuggling routes, payoffs, and even the names of guards. Landry closed the book slowly, her pulse quickening. If the gangs had struck a temporary alliance, however fragile, it would explain the message. It wasn't a gang war, it was a power play. And Hollister had been the pawn sacrificed to prove a point. But the real shock came when the lab results on the blood writing returned. DNA testing revealed that not all the blood on the wall belonged to Hollister or Soto. There was a third contributor, unknown, unrecorded, and unaccounted for inside the prison's population database. Someone else had been in that cell. Someone who had bled, left their mark, and vanished without trace. For Detective Landry, the case had shifted from a violent feud to something far darker. Angola wasn't just a prison with gangs and corruption. It was a prison with secrets buried deep in its walls, secrets powerful enough to rewrite everything people thought they knew about America's most notorious penitentiary. And as she stepped out of Camp D into the suffocating Louisiana night, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The murder wasn't just about rival gangs. A coded notebook and unidentified blood suggested a hidden alliance, and a secret player inside Angola no one had accounted for. Inside Angola Prison, blood deals and buried secret. The air over Angola Prison felt heavier in the days after James read Hollister's killing. Rumors traveled faster than the guards' radios, carried through whispers between chow lines and coded notes slipped under cell doors. Everyone seemed to know something, yet no one dared to say it aloud. Detective Marie Landry sat alone at her kitchen table, the black notebook spread open beneath the dim glow of a lamp. Her eyes traced the coded entries again and again, initials, numbers, strange phrases. AB plus LK equals arrangement. Resolution pending. Payment delayed. She knew she was staring at the skeleton of a deal between two of the prison's most dangerous gangs. What she couldn't figure out was why Hollister had it, and why he was dead because of it. More troubling was the DNA report. The blood on the wall carried 3 profiles, but the third didn't match any inmate currently housed inside Angola. The state's database showed nothing. It wasn't a guard either. Corrections officers were tested regularly. Whoever had been in that cell left behind a trace of themselves but no record, like a ghost moving through the block. When Landry returned to Angola the next morning, the prison was already boiling with tension. The Aryan Brotherhood blamed the Latin kings. The Latin kings swore Hollister had brought his death upon himself. The warden gave the same tight-lipped statement he always did. Violence is regrettable but inevitable in a prison of this size. But Landry knew better. This wasn't inevitable. It was orchestrated. She requested access to visitor logs from the past 6 months. At first glance, they looked routine. Family members, lawyers, clergy. But one name kept appearing: Thomas Reverend Kane. Officially, he was listed as a chaplain volunteer. Unofficially, whispers painted him as something else: a smuggler who used religion as cover. Inmates told Landry that Reverend Kane moved freely across the prison, carrying more than Bibles. Cigarettes, phones, drugs, all blessed under his false ministry. One inmate claimed Kane was the only outsider who could walk into any block and come out untouched. And he had been inside Angola the day Hollister died. Could the unidentified blood belong to him? That afternoon, Landry walked into Camp D again. She wanted another look at the scene, even if the cell had already been scrubbed clean. The air still carried the faint metallic smell of blood mixed with disinfectant. Standing in the empty cell, she tried to reconstruct the fight. Hollister stabbed, Soto wounded, a third man leaving a message in blood. She crouched down, fingertips brushing the cracks in the concrete. Something caught her eye, a tiny shard of plastic wedged between the floor and the wall. She pulled it free. It was part of a cell phone casing, broken and bloodied. If Hollister's notebook hinted at a smuggling network, this fragment was proof it existed. Angola was supposed to be locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Yet phones moved through its walls like contraband currency, controlled by whoever ran the network. Landry took the evidence back to Baton Rouge for testing. The lab confirmed what she suspected. The blood on the plastic matched the third, unidentified DNA profile. Whoever had written that message on the wall wasn't just present, they had handled the phone. That night, she couldn't sleep. She scrolled through old case files, reports on Angola stretching back decades. She read about the 1950s work gangs, where prisoners were whipped if they slowed in the field. The 1970s lawsuits that exposed rampant brutality. The 1990s killings that sparked nationwide outrage. Angola wasn't just a prison. It was a system that had learned to bury its darkest truths beneath layers of silence. But silence had a way of breaking when blood was spilled. 2 days later, she got the call. Juan Soto, the Latin king who had survived Hollister's attack, had vanished from the prison hospital wing. Guards claimed he was transferred to another facility for security reasons. Landry wasn't buying it. The hospital log showed no transfer orders. No paperwork. Just empty space where his name used to be. Someone wanted Soto gone, either to silence him or to keep him hidden. She drove back to Angola, her badge heavy in her pocket. The warden stonewalled her. "Detective Landry, this is an internal matter. The Department of Corrections has protocols. Inmates get moved all the time. Without paperwork," she shot back. The warden didn't flinch. Sometimes the safest way to keep a man alive is to make him disappear. Landry stared at him. Was he admitting something? Or was he warning her to back off? On her way out, she passed the prison chapel. The door stood open, the faint sound of hymns echoing inside. And there, standing at the pulpit with a Bible in one hand and a knowing smirk on his face, was Thomas Reverend Kane. His eyes locked onto hers. And in that instant, Landry knew, the ghost she was chasing wasn't invisible at all. He was standing right in front of her, daring her to see him. The following week, a brown envelope appeared on Landry's desk at the sheriff's office. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Hollister and Soto, alive, sitting in a prison dormitory months earlier. Standing behind them, with his hands on both their shoulders, was Kane. On the back of the photo, written in jagged handwriting, were 4 words: "Blood pays for silence." Landry's hands trembled as she set the photo down. Hollister's death wasn't just a gang killing. It was part of something bigger, a network that reached beyond Angola's walls, connecting inmates, guards, and outsiders. A network willing to kill to keep its secrets buried. And with Soto vanished, Hollister dead, and Kane still moving freely inside Angola, Landry realized she wasn't just investigating a murder. She was stepping into a war, one where the line between criminal and authority blurred until you couldn't tell them apart. The mysterious Reverend Kane emerges as the likely key to Angola's darkest secrets. One victim is dead, the other has disappeared, and Landry holds a photo that suggests this is more than prison gangs. It's a criminal empire operating inside Angola itself. Inside Angola Prison, the empire in the shadows. The photo on Landry's desk was more than evidence. It was a warning. Blood pays for silence. Those words burned in her mind as she stared at the image of Thomas, Reverend Kane, standing over James Hollister and Juan Soto like a puppeteer over his marionettes. Landry had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a case wasn't just a case. This was a message aimed directly at her. We know you're watching. We know where you are. But she wasn't the kind to back off. Her first move was to dig deeper into Kane's past. On paper, he was clean, a religious volunteer who had been working in Louisiana prisons for nearly a decade. His file listed him as an ordained minister, certified through a small church in Baton Rouge that barely existed beyond a mailing address. But behind that thin veneer of legitimacy, shadows loomed. Bank records, the few she could access, showed cash deposits in strange amounts, always under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting. Surveillance reports from other investigators hinted that Kane's visits to Angola coincided with spikes in contraband seizures elsewhere. And then there were the whispers that Kane wasn't a minister at all but a middleman, the glue between gangs, guards, and outside criminal syndicates. If that was true, then Angola wasn't just a prison, it was a hub. And Kane was its invisible hand. The pressure mounted when Landry received a late-night call from one of her informants inside Angola. The man's voice shook as he spoke, his words quick and clipped. "They're watching you, detective. You dig any deeper, and they'll bury you same as Hollister." "Who?" Landry pressed. "The Reverend. But he ain't working alone. Guards, captains, even higher. Angola's just the farm, detective. The real harvest happens outside." Before she could ask more, the line went dead. The next day, Landry drove the long stretch of highway toward Angola, her car swallowed by the dense Louisiana wood. The prison loomed ahead, 18,000 acres of razor wire, fields, and watchtowers that once overlooked slaves and now oversaw prisoners. She wasn't here to interrogate Kane directly. Not yet. Instead, she tracked down an old correctional officer, a man who had retired in silence after nearly 30 years at Angola. He lived in a modest trailer just outside St. Francisville, a recluse haunted by the things he had seen. When Landry showed him the photo, his face went pale. "You don't want to know about Kane," he whispered. "That man, he's not just smuggling phones and drugs. He's the broker. The gangs can't talk directly, not with the surveillance, not with the walls. He talks for them. He makes the deals. And if one side doesn't pay," he tapped the photo with a shaking hand. "Blood pays for silence." The retired guard told her about nights when shipments moved through Angola disguised as church supplies. Crates labeled as Bibles were carried past checkpoints without inspection. Inmates who resisted Kane's network wound up dead, their bodies staged as suicides or overdoses. And the warden? Landry asked. The guard's eyes dropped. Some of them get a cut. Some just look away. Angola eats men alive, detective. And if you go against the system, it'll eat you too. Her instincts screamed that he was telling the truth. But truth didn't mean safety. That evening, as Landry pulled into her driveway, she noticed the faint crunch of gravel behind her. A black pickup truck had been idling down the road, its headlights off. The moment her car slowed, the truck roared to life, engine growling like a predator. It surged forward, forcing her to swerve hard onto the shoulder. The driver's face was hidden under a cap, but his intent was clear. This wasn't random. It was a warning. Landry barely managed to escape, her tires spitting dirt as she sped away. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, the truck was gone, swallowed by the night. The attempt on her life confirmed what she already suspected: she was getting too close. And the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. Back at her desk, she stared at the notebook again, focusing on the initials. Most were indecipherable. But one caught her attention: T.C., scrawled multiple times, linked to transactions, always paired with different gang names. Thomas Kane. Hollister had been documenting every deal Kane brokered, every shifting alliance between gangs who should have been at war but were, under Kane's hand, cooperating in silence. Hollister's notebook wasn't just contraband. It was a death sentence, and maybe he knew it. The missing piece was Juan Soto. If he was alive, he was the only direct witness who could confirm the truth. But his disappearance from the hospital suggested Kane had him. Hidden, silenced, or worse. Determined to find him, Landry pulled strings with a contact in the Department of Corrections. Late one night, she received an encrypted email with a single attachment, a transfer log not meant for public eyes. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled. Juan Soto's name was there, transferred not to another prison, but to Camp J, Angola's notorious disciplinary block. Camp J had been shut down years ago after reports of torture and abuse. Officially, it didn't exist anymore. But if Soto was there, it meant Angola was running a ghost unit off the books. And if Camp J was still active, it was the perfect place to make a man disappear. The next morning, Landry drove back to Angola under the guise of a routine interview. But her true goal was Camp J. The abandoned building stood apart from the main complex, its windows boarded, its walls cracked with age. Weeds crawled through the concrete, making it look like a forgotten ruin. But as Landry approached, she noticed something off: a fresh set of tire tracks in the dirt, leading straight to the building's rear entrance. Her heart hammered as she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust, but beneath it was something else: the faint echo of voices. She followed the sound down a dark corridor until it gave way to a faint metallic clang, like shackles rattling. At the end of the hall, behind a steel door, she heard it clearly, a man's voice, weak but alive. "Help me," it was Soto. Before she could react, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, flashlight beam cutting across the hallway, and froze. Thomas Kane stood there, calm as ever, a Bible in one hand and something heavier in the other, a pistol. His smile was cold, his voice steady. "Detective Landry," he said softly, "I was wondering when you'd find your way here. I admire your persistence. But persistence in Angola," he raised the gun, his eyes dark with certainty, "has a price. Landry has tracked Soto to Angola's hidden ghost unit, Camp J, only to come face to face with Reverend Kane himself, armed and waiting. Inside Angola Prison, the last confession." The barrel of Thomas Kane's pistol gleamed in the thin shaft of light seeping through Camp J's boarded windows. Detective Marie Landry felt her pulse drum in her ears. Behind the steel door, Juan Soto's muffled cries echoed, weak and desperate, confirming he was still alive, for now. Kane's calm, almost pastoral tone sent a chill down her spine. "You've come a long way, detective. Most people who sniff around Angola's secrets stop when they get close enough to smell the rot. You walked right into it." Landry's eyes flicked to the pistol, then to the Bible in his other hand. "This is how you hide? With scripture and blood." Kane chuckled softly. "Scripture is the perfect mask. Who questions the man of God? I carry hope in one hand and power in the other. Angola's always been about power." He gestured with the gun toward the hallway. "Walk." Landry obeyed, her mind racing. She counted her steps, every crack in the floor, every echo. If she could get him talking, keep him distracted, maybe she could turn this around. "Why Hollister?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. "Why kill him if he was part of your operation?" Kane's jaw tightened. "Because he forgot his place. He thought the notebook gave him leverage. He started whispering about exposing me, about cutting me out." "That notebook you found?" "It wasn't his protection. It was his execution order." Landry's stomach twisted. Hollister hadn't been a victim of gang politics. He'd been silenced for daring to step outside Kane's shadow. "And Soto?" she pressed. Kane's smile returned, cold and thin. "Soto's alive because I say he is. He saw what happened. He knows the truth. But the truth is a commodity, detective. In Angola, everything is for sale, even silence." They reached the steel door. Kane unlocked it with a key that jingled against his belt. Inside, Soto sat shackled to a rusted cot, his face pale, his body bruised. His eyes widened at the sight of Landry. "Help me," he whispered. Kane stepped in behind her, gun raised. "You see, detective, this is the part where you make a choice. Walk away and you'll live. Stay and you'll die here with him. Either way, the story never leaves these walls." Landry's mind raced. Every instinct told her she wouldn't make it out alive unless she acted now. Slowly, she shifted her weight, her hand brushing the edge of her jacket where her service weapon rested. Hidden but heavy. "You talk about power," she said, her voice low. "But power built on fear always crumbles. Hollister's dead. Soto's barely alive. And me? I'm still standing. You can't silence everyone." Kane's smile faltered for the first time. He raised the gun higher. "I don't need to silence everyone. Just enough." The next seconds blurred into violence. Landry dropped low, yanking her weapon free as Kane pulled the trigger. The gunshot thundered through the small room, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches above her head. She fired back, her shot striking Kane's shoulder and spinning him against the wall. The Bible slipped from his hand, thudding to the floor, its pages splayed and stained with his blood. Kane cursed, clutching his wound but refusing to fall. His eyes burned with fury as he staggered toward her. "You think this ends with me?" "Angola is bigger than one man. You can't kill the system." Landry fired again. The bullet struck center mass. This time, Kane collapsed, the pistol clattering across the concrete. His final breath came out as a rasping whisper, "Blood pays for silence." Then he was gone. Landry rushed to Soto, breaking his shackles with trembling hands. "You're safe now," she said, though her own voice betrayed her doubt. Soto shook his head weakly. "No one's safe. Not in Angola. Kane was just one, there are others. Guards, captains, they'll come for me. They'll come for you." His words sank into her like ice. She knew he was right. Killing Kane wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. By dawn, backup arrived. Camp J was swarmed with investigators, deputies, and crime scene tech. They carried Kane's body out under a sheet. Landry turned the notebook over to federal agents, every page a map of Angola's hidden empire. Soto was taken into protective custody, though Landry doubted protection would last long. Reporters circled like vultures, hungry for a headline. "Detective," one shouted, "is it true Angola's chaplain was running a gang empire inside the prison?" Landry didn't answer. She couldn't. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was only part of the truth. Weeks later, when the dust settled, official statements framed Kane as a rogue volunteer who had infiltrated the system. A lone wolf, they called him. Convenient. Clean. Easy to swallow. But Landry knew better. The notebook hadn't just listed gangs and deals. It had initials tied to names she recognized, names of wardens, state officials, even politicians. Angola wasn't just rotting from the inside. Its corruption reached far beyond the razor wire, spreading like roots across Louisiana and into places few dared to look. Kane's death silenced one voice, but the system he served was still alive, still watching. One night, long after the case was closed, Landry sat alone in her office. The Bible that had fallen from Kane's hand lay on her desk. She had picked it up before leaving Camp J, a relic of the man who had weaponized faith. Inside the cover, scrawled in bloodied handwriting, she found a final message she hadn't seen before. "This is only the beginning." Landry leaned back, staring at the words. She thought of Hollister's blood on the wall, Soto's warnings, the shadows that stretched beyond Angola. And she knew, deep down, the message was true. Angola was more than a prison. It was a mirror held up to America's darkest truths. And sometimes, the scariest part of a true crime story isn't the ending. It's knowing the story never really ends. Detective Landry survived Angola's secrets, but the empire behind its walls still lingers in the shadows. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what comes next. Hit subscribe, and don't miss it.